in today's video, I am going to attempt to make in Blender the Dextus Class Frigate. The Dextus class is the class of frigate that the Drella is, which is what my books are based around. And I have been drawing for about 30 years, since I was about the age of 15, when I first came up with the ideas for my books and everything, that I started coming up with these designs. I was drawing them on squared paper, graph paper and everything else, going all the way back to the very beginning. And I've done other designs for ships and come up with other designs as well for other classes of ship in the Delta Navy. But I always keep coming back to this Dextus Class Frigate. It's such a simplistic design. It is basically a flying space tank. Now, this isn't the first time I have attempted to make a model. The one you can see on screen here is actually a model that I built in the old GMAX program many moons ago. And then I even rendered it up. I imported it into Bryce at the time, as it was. Programs that are now long gone, no longer really that well considered anymore. I think barely anyone ever would use it anymore. And everything's been done in things like Blender these days. So I thought, right, let's try and recreate it. And as you can see from the model that we have here loaded into Blender at the moment, this is the actual original model that I built. And yeah, I mean, it gets the shape, it gets the design, but there's not a lot of detail. It's a bit blocky. I mean, I think I could do a lot better. And yeah, why not? Let's try and see if we can actually improve on where we were to begin with. Now, as I'm going through this, I am sure people are going to be watching this going, yeah, you're doing that wrong. You could do things better. Like, I am by no means an expert at Blender. I got some experience with Blender. Don't get me wrong. I've done some animation before when I was doing my old gaming series. And I've done a few things with Blender before. And I'm not going to say I'm a complete novice, but at the same time, I'm far from an expert either. So if you see things that I could improve, don't forget to just drop a comment, say, hey, Draken, when you were doing this, you could have done this and it would have been a bit quicker and everything else. Nonetheless, this process actually going through building this ship, it was also been a bit of a learning curve for me as well. So I've been learning some things. There have been bits when I wanted to do something, I had to go away and research it, learn it, come back. And it's been quite a nice, enjoyable experience working on this ship all the way through. So I'm just going to time lapse a bit of the construction, getting it back to where it was originally, trying to basically get it to the same place we had the original GMAX model to begin with before we start putting some extra detail on here. And I built this sort of 1/3 scale. Don't ask me why I decided to do it 1/3 of the scale. Probably later on it would have been easier when doing some of the details to be at full scale. But, you know, that's the way it turned out. I can always scale it up at the end if I really want it to actually match the scale it shows in Blender and have 1 meter equal 1 meter. But the ship's about 40 meters long. It has 2 decks, plus it also has the bombard cannons that sit on top as well. It's like this big turret with 2 huge cannons that sit on the top that rotate. And yeah, it has a crew of about 17, so you've got 1 commanding officer on board, and you've got 8 bridge crew, which is usually made up of 2 watches, and you would normally have a helmsman, navigator, a tactical officer, and a communications stroke electronic warfare officer as well, sitting on the bridge. Plus, she also has 8 engineers, and also the capacity to carry up to 4 guests as well. And you'll see as we're building this, there's like a little indent on the lower deck on the right-hand side. I'll say little indent, it's quite a large indent that's quite blank there. That's actually, I mean, I don't cover this in the first book, actually, and it's something that'll probably get covered in later books and novels because I plan to write a full series. That bit is actually what's called a special operations module. It's an interchangeable module. So it could be just that they use that for cargo space. They could turn around and put in there all sorts of things like a sensor suite in there. They could put extra weapon systems in there. They could put in like little fighter bays, something like that, depending on what specialist equipment they need for different missions. So there's a little bit of adaptability on these small frigates. And they're like a bit of a mainstay. They're one of the smallest ships in the fleet, but they're sort of a bit like a workhorse, so to speak. You can use a lot of these. The bombardment cannons on the top aren't the fastest to aim with, but they are incredibly powerful weapons, as we find out in the first book. Very useful, but obviously not great against faster moving craft like some of the enemies they encounter during the book itself. But as I said, essentially here, I'm just trying to get it back to where it was. I quite like as well these angled plates that you see on the side of it as well. Kind of sort of that reminiscence of what you get on modern day tanks. Angled armor, there's a reason why you put angled armor. Now, it's not going to really matter too much in space because your angles in space, you're going to be all at different orientations, rotations. But angled armor actually tends to be a little bit stronger than straight armor because you're presenting a stronger cross section to anything coming in. So I thought, yeah, I'll just put a little bit of slopes in there, just make it a bit more angular. Also just helps break it up, doesn't make it a complete just block, because even though it's quite a simplistic design, as you saw from the diagrams earlier, I want to really sort of create some detail in here as well. And those sort of angled plates around the side there, I think really sort of help add to the sort of look of this being quite a heavily armored vehicle in itself, and an armored ship. And one of the things I like as well is that when it comes to doing things like the boosters on the back, you can see that this time using Blender, I managed to actually smooth them out a lot. I used Subdivide on these to begin with, the Subdivide modifier. Later on, I discovered about auto smoothing, and I used that on a few more of the cylindrical objects later on. But yeah, there's a few little tactics and everything else that you can do just to make things look more round. Because back in the days of Gmax, it was literally you just had to keep putting polygons in until you made it as round as you like, and you didn't have the computing power that we have now to be able to actually produce really nice smooth graphics like we do now. But here we are, we have actually got the ship basically back to where we started with the Gmax model, a little bit smoother in things like the thrusters and everything else, but this is a great sort of starting point now for us to actually go on and actually take it to the next level, start actually putting some detail into the ship. Okay, so it's time to start working on some of the details. And I started with the airlocks. Now, you'll see me beginning the airlocks here, but I actually changed up the airlocks a bit later on as well. But some of the details I put on the inside, I put a little keypad in there, and also putting in a little vent as well. Because if you've got an airlock and it's going to attach up with another airlock somewhere, you're going to need to pump atmosphere between the two sides, especially if it's like a hard airlock where it's got a bit of space between. You're going to need to pump out the vacuum. I mean, technically you can open the doors and just let the air rush out, but that's going to reduce your pressure a little bit inside, and probably not the best way of doing it. So you probably want to pressurize it in the sort of seal between the two sides. But moving on from the airlock, we move on to these little gizmos that are going to appear around the actual ship itself. And yeah, for this, we need to really have a conversation about, really, I'm trying to make sure that there are parts in the ship that actually look like it would make it a functional ship in space. And one of the problems that you're going to face with an actual ship that works in space is, how does the ship turn? How does it maneuver around? And for that, we're actually going to turn to some actual real-world science. And you thought you were just here to watch a video about someone making a model for his books, and actually I'm going to get some stealth education in there. Actually, I'm not the best science commentator out there, but I do have some understanding of science, so I'm going to try and explain this the best I can. Now, there are a couple of ways in which you can get a ship to orientate itself when it's out in space. The first method, which is used quite often by things like satellites that we have, is something called reaction wheels. Basically, imagine you have two wheels side by side with each other with a motor attached between them. If you spin the motor, it's not going to be just one wheel that turns, but both wheels are going to turn in opposing directions. And this is in relation to Newton's third law of motion, which says that for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So yeah, I mean, you can do this experiment without even needing to be put in space. If you just had two wheels, put a motor between them, powered up the motor, both sides are going to spin in opposing directions. But now imagine if those wheels were different sizes. If one wheel was much bigger, had a lot more mass, and the other wheel was a lot smaller, would they stop spinning in opposing directions? The answer is no. They do continue to spin in opposing directions, but what actually happens is, because the smaller wheel hasn't got as much mass, the bigger wheel is going to take a longer time to turn. But if you then spun the smaller wheel faster, and much faster, you could still get back to that same rate of turn on the bigger wheel again. And this is how reaction wheels actually work in the real world. We put these on satellites in order to help orientate them. Essentially what it is 3 of these wheels that are attached to the spacecraft. Instead of a big wheel, it's the spacecraft itself. They just sit in the middle of the spacecraft and they just spin really fast so that it actually begins to orientate the ship in different directions. So by having 3 of them in there, you have it basically your 3 axes of direction. Now, reaction wheels are all well and good, but they're great for like very fine tuning of movement and everything, but they're not really the best way to actually maneuver a ship when you really need to get it maneuvered around. Plus, also, if we're going to do reaction wheels on a ship, you're not going to see them, because reaction wheels are something that's usually buried deep within the ship itself. But that's okay, because there are other ways in which we can get the ship orientated in a better way. So take your average rocket, and we're going to go and do a little bit of rocket science here. It's nothing major, don't worry, we're not going to turn around and go into all complex mathematical equations or anything else. But the way a rocket essentially works is that when the rocket fires out the back, it's basically throwing energy and force out the back of the ship. And in doing so, going back to what we just discussed, that Newton's third law of motion, for every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. The equal and opposite reaction of throwing that energy out of the back of the ship is that the ship gets propelled in the opposite direction. And incidentally, that's what a lot of flat earthers get wrong. And oh no, I've done it now. I've mentioned the flat earthers. We'll probably have loads of bots turning up on the comments section soon. But no, you hear people say, oh, spaceships can't possibly work, rockets can't possibly work because they've got nothing to push off in the vacuum of space. But that's not what's happening. It's this equal and opposite reaction according to Newton's third law of motion. But we have this idea that if we send energy out the back of the ship is going to perfectly fly forwards. But we are forgetting there is one other thing we have to take into consideration, and that's something called center of mass. So we have here a ship which has 2 engines instead of 1 engine, and a center of mass. And the center of mass is essentially just the central point where in the opposing directions, the mass, that's basically how heavy it is, though not necessarily the same as weight, because weight is when you're within a gravity zone, but it's the same mass exists on either side, normally towards the center of a ship. But if you have something heavier in one end of the ship, your center of mass is going to move towards that. But imagine we just fire one of the 2 rockets now. We now have an off-centered force. So the force is coming out of one side, and the force pushing it forward is going to be stronger on one side of the ship than it is on the other. And because the force is stronger on one side of the ship than it is on the other, we're going to end up with the ship being pushed more on one side than the other, and it's going to pivot. And this is exactly how maneuver thrusters work. You can dot maneuver thrusters all around your craft. Now, if we had all the maneuver thrusters on one side of the craft firing in one direction, the craft is just going to translate or slide in the opposing direction, which is a great way of maneuvering around without actually changing your orientation. In essence, this is no different really than just throwing the energy out the back of the ship and you're being propelled forward. It's just you're doing it in a different direction. But if you fire your thrusters in the opposing corners of the ship itself, you're now putting pressure on both sides of the ship to go in opposing directions, which means if this is either side of your center of mass, this is going to rotate your ship. Now, there are many different ways in which you can configure maneuvering thrusters, and we use maneuvering thrusters on modern rockets. Go and look at some of the footage of like SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket when it's coming back down. You'll see these bursts of jets coming out of it as it maneuvers itself around. But for something like a cuboid object, probably one of the good configurations, not the only configuration you can have, but it's basically just to put a cluster of maneuver jets on each and every single corner. In this example, you basically have 3 jets on every single corner. There is 8 corners. It basically equals to 24 individual jets. And this will give you considerable amount of maneuverability. But this comes back to these little devices that you see me building onto the Dextus Class Frigate here. Instead of putting 3 jets on every single corner, I have them gimbaled on this like little ball-like object that can basically quickly rotate with a single jet. I just think it would look cool just to see it sort of flicking around. And it also means that you can get it into angles a bit more than if it was just like static jets pointing out in different locations. These are quite small nozzles, but they can be tucked away in the corners, just basically adding in that little extra detail. Okay, now we're starting to get into the bulk of the design on this, and we're going to start adding in, I think the 3D modelers call it greebles. It all goes back to the old modeling days when you're doing models out of plastic kits and you're getting like the leftover bits of plastic sprue and you use it to make detail. One of the things, though, with doing this, sort of adding this detail, I don't just want to add random detail around the ship. I wanted to make it look like there is purpose for all the detail that's on here and actually think about the things that I'm putting on and what they are going to be able to actually function as. But one of the more detailed areas that I'm working on is the engines at the back here, and trying to get as much detail in here, but still want to make it look like all the pipework and everything else is there for a reason. There is a purpose, and adding in things like little fuel ports and everything else for refueling. Like I got on either side, I put in like 6 fuel ports so that it is capable of doing refueling, like if it was just replenishing in space. Or what we call a RIS for short, RIS. A bit like RAS, if you've ever got any used to any sort of naval terms, which is replenishment at sea. Instead, I was just thinking that the term replenishment in space, and RIS or RIS, is something that spaceships will do when they're out there in the deep void and need to get new food and fuel and oxygen, etc. back on board. Because there's probably on board recyclers and everything, but you're probably going to want some fresh oxygen to top up the tanks every now and then, as well as obviously all the stuff like the fuel and water and wastewater to be extracted, etc. And these ships are designed to last for quite a while and go for several months in space. And I was getting quite happy with all the details that I've been adding onto the ship, but as I was adding these bits on the top here, I was trying to sort of think about building vents on top here because I know the internal layout of the ship, and this is basically roughly where the electrical generator exists on board the vessel. An electrical generator is going to produce a lot of heat, so I was going to put some vents up here. And the way I was going to build the vents was I was building sort of the original platform, and there's a thing you can do in Blender where you do something called a Boolean, where it's basically you take two objects, or two or more objects, and you put them together, and you apply the Boolean, and you can do a subtraction on it, and it's going to create an indent. And I was going to do the vent that way, but as I was lining up the objects, I realized it looked like something else, and reminded me of something that you sort of get from inside your PC. It looked like a heatsink, and I thought, well, actually, these are on top of an electrical generator, and I'm doing it to extract heat. A heatsink would be actually really quite appropriate. Now, I wouldn't imagine you would have the heatsink on all of the time, because you wouldn't want to have a heavy infrared signature kicking out the back of your ship, because that would just give away your ship's position. But if you needed to do sort of an emergency cool down, or if you're in an area of space where you're not worried about having to store up your heat and not giving off so much of a heat signature, then some really good heat sinks on the back of the ship would probably be a good idea. And it sort of kind of look cool and look different to just having vents all the time all over the ship itself and actually having something else. Now, I actually haven't spoken about why I'm doing this, why I'm building this ship or rebuilding this ship after all this time and trying to make it a bit more detailed. And obviously this whole channel is dedicated to the idea of the fact that I'm trying to get my books published and out there, and sort of showing this universe that I have built on a large scale here. And I figured, well, actually, I'm going to need some background material here. And I don't really want to just go and turn to and do the cheaty thing and just go and get AI to do it all for me, because that would be just silly. I want to try and actually put proper original stuff out there and actually have some sort of backgrounds for a lot of the videos that I'm doing. So I thought I'd put some animations together, as well as getting some nice still images of things from the universe itself. And yeah, I've done lots of pictures over the years, and you saw earlier I'd done some sort of CGI many years ago, but obviously that looks really dated. It's very basic, it's very simple, and I thought it's about time we had something a bit more up to date. So that's essentially why I'm building this. It's just so I can get a load of nice cool stills, and also to get some animations and stuff I can use in videos. And it would be just this. I think I might design a few more ships and stuff as we go along, and plus it also adds something else that's nice to the channel that actually sort of is involved with the background of the universe itself, sort of helps encourage or show what it is, but also at the same time isn't just me sitting here just talking about my books all the time. It actually gives you a bit more in-depth detail, and you get to see it coming together in front of your eyes, so to speak. And one of the interesting things that I find as we're going through this is like how things have evolved over the years. So like you think the ship has been in my head and drawn and written out for about 30 odd years. And when I first sort of designed the ship, it basically was just the ship with the bombardment cannons on the top. You had the special operations module on the side. That was it. And as I was writing the books and doing the rewrites, because I've rewritten my first novel now about 10 times before I was actually happy with it and wanted to actually go out and seek publication for it, that one of the things that I sort of earlier came in sort of halfway through the drafts and everything else was actually realizing that the ship had no actual countermeasure system. There was no sort of defense against things like torpedoes and missiles being fired against it. And I thought, well, that wouldn't be quite right. So later on in the book series, later on in the drafts and everything else, I started writing in there that actually these ships do have countermeasures and a countermeasure launcher on the back of the ship. And I always just sort of figured it was built somewhere into the back of the hull, somewhere at the back of the engine somewhere. Would make the most sense to put it there somewhere. But never really put it into the design properly. So that's what I'm just constructing here. So this is how sort of the design has continued to evolve over time to include extra items like this, like the countermeasures on the back here in order to help defend it. Now, after I started putting the countermeasures in, I then started doing all the greebles across the back there, put all this lovely pipe work that goes in the back there as well, which really helps sort of sell the idea that this is essentially the engine end of the ship, and it's got these powerful engines. And you'll notice there's like 6 nozzles out the back here. 2 of those are for the FTL engines. That's the big nozzles. And then the 4 smaller ones are part of its sublight engines set up there as well. So it's like 2 different sets of engines at the back. But I realized there was a bit of an imbalance. It just felt a little bit imbalanced between having the countermeasure launcher on the top, and there was essentially just nothing underneath. And I started trying to think, well, what could we put underneath it? And then I came up with the idea of building what's essentially, it's a holder. You won't be able to see all of it here when I model it, but it's the holder for it. But it's a tow rope. Now, a tow rope in space may or may not, depending on how you think about it, be a good or a bad idea. You see, the problem with towing is that if you've got a flexible cord, it's all well and good if you are propelling yourself forward. Because if you're going forward, you're putting your thrust forward from your front ship. And if you're towing a ship that hasn't got any engine power, it's lost its engines, you want your ship in front to pull it along. It's going to pull it along with it. And as it goes forward, it will pull the ship behind it along with it. But then what happens when you then put in reverse thrust and you slow your ship down and you start going in the opposite direction? Well, the ship behind you has no control. The cord is flexible. It's no longer taut. And so the ship is going to basically just continue coasting towards the back of your ship until you end up with a collision. So, I mean, that's no good at all. We can't have ships sort of colliding in the middle of towing. Now, there is ways in which you can get around that, you know, where you sort of have to move your ship out of the way, and then it sort of ends up with it sort of flinging off, and it becomes really difficult to control. And so it's sort of, I came up with this idea that this rope that they sort of extend between is some sort of futuristic cable, and it's quite flexible until they sort of run a current down it, and then it suddenly sort of becomes a lot more solidified, and it becomes almost like you've got a pole connecting the two ships. Now, that's going to be a bit of a problem, though, still in itself, because essentially you've now just moved the center of mass into the middle of the pole, especially if you're like towing a ship of about the same sort of mass as your first ship. So like if you're towing another Dextus Class Frigate behind you. So if you start doing the maneuvers on the front sort of part of the ship itself, and you do it normally, it's not going to work, first of all, because it's all in front of the center of mass. It's going to be problematic in trying to actually make any sort of changes in positioning. So you're going to have to turn around and change the directions in which you do it. And you're not going to have as much flexibility as you do when the ship is just on its own. And you're going to have to be careful about how much pressure you put on there, because that center of mass is in the middle of that cable. And even though it's a cable that's probably solidified it up, it's probably not the strongest point in the whole of the ship, and you're now using that as your center of mass, so there's going to be a lot of strain down there. So I'd imagine that really towing for these ships isn't something that you do very often. It's just done as an emergency. Normally there'll probably be other ships that are designed for rescuing other vessels and helping them out and towing them to different locations that are purposely designed for it. But the tow rope on the back of these is for emergency situations. You know, you've just been in a battle, one of your ships has lost power. If you're not careful, it's going to drift out and its orbit's going to take it and make it collide with another object somewhere. So you just want to basically just pull it off and pull it to somewhere safe before you can then carry on and wait for a proper ship to come along and rescue it. So it's like an emergency tow rope rather than actually being a proper tow rope for like just continually towing things all the time. So next up, it was time to pay attention to the engines at the back of the ship. Already the details were starting to come together, and I was starting to love the way the engine block was looking at the back. But then as I looked at the actual thruster tubes themselves, I thought, these actually look a little too smooth. Though before, yeah, we obviously smoothed them out, made them round, and that looked great. They just seem to be lacking in any sort of detail. And the weird thing is, like, for like all of the 30 years, I'd always imagined these thruster tubes to just be smooth, long tubes that came out the back of the ship. And now I was looking at it and sort of thinking, there's not enough detail on these. These really need to be sort of turned into something else. And I started with the FTL engine tubes, and I became very happy with the way they turned out. And then I moved on to the sublight engines, and oh, I can tell you, right, I am so happy with the way these turned out. Yeah, I know, I stopped. I made a lot of detail on here, an awful lot of detail, and probably more detail than I was intending on these actual sublight engines. But the final result, I think, was well worth it. I think it was at this point I actually realized I was beginning to fall in love with this ship. I was loving the detail that was coming together and realizing this was such a worthwhile project, well worth doing. As I was just looking at the detail coming together, it was just like seeing this ship that's been in my mind for so long coming to life, and coming to life in a way more than I had ever expected. It just feels more real now, just looking at the ship like this as I've been modeling this into the 3D thing. And so it was just like I was determined now. I really needed to finish this model, really get all of the detail in there. But yeah, I mean, yeah, just look at this. I'm just so happy with how it progressed so far, especially with this back engine block. And so with that in mind, I realized I had to turn my attention back to the airlocks. I was not happy with the way the airlocks originally looked. I had sort of based them more on what was originally done. And though it was the first thing I did put some details in, I realized I had to go back and actually redo those and make them look better than they did. And I'm glad I did. And especially this underneath airlock. I mean, the underneath airlock is more than just a normal airlock. This is actually, I mean, if you remember seeing the pictures I showed at the beginning, you'll see that in some of the images I had of the Dextus Class Frigate, there was like another little shuttlecraft docked underneath it. Now, with that, the idea is that the underneath airlock is also a hard point for solid docking, so that it can sustain through FTL travel. So it can carry like a shuttlecraft that's capable of atmospheric travel underneath it, or you could use it to dock up with a bigger ship, and it can be carried along with a bigger ship. And that's what the hard point underneath is. So there had to be a little bit more extra detail and like locking mechanisms built under here. And they even put some like fuel ports in here as well, so that you can also connect up as well while it's in flight. And of course, with the underneath airlock being made to look better, I also had to do the side airlocks as well. And there was a little bit of redoing that. I mean, I reused some of the detail I built at the beginning, like the keypads and the vents and everything else. But I just really wanted to do the docking collar and make it look better. And I also adjusted the door heights to be actually a little bit closer to an actual door height. I sort of worked out what the measurements would be so that it's actually properly to scale on the side of the ship. So it actually just sits and looks better. And I think it's a vast improvement when I redid the airlocks here. One of the other things I built onto the side here was this sort of little box on one side. It's basically emergency solar paneling. Now, most of the time the ship will probably be away from a star, so you wouldn't be able to use the solar panel. But if the electrical generator was to go, there are backup batteries on board. But you imagine that if you do end up with your ship being quite heavily damaged and you do happen to be close enough to a star to be able to draw on solar energy, then having a backup solar panel could be very useful. So the idea of this box on the side here, again, just keeping practical sort of elements to the details that we're putting in here, is actually the emergency solar paneling that could be opened up and a large solar panel extended out the side of the ship just for emergency purposes to try and keep things sustained. Now, I'm really proud of this next bit of details putting on here, because you see, ever since I came up with the design for the ship, there's always been one thing that has bugged me, and that is, how do the crew get off the ship in an emergency? And I couldn't work out where to put escape pods or anything else like that on the ships. I did toy with the idea that in the middle of the turret that there was like a lift that goes up and that could turn into an escape module, but to carry 17 crew plus up to 4 guests, it probably wasn't going to be enough. And then I was trying to come up with new ideas for details to put on the outside of the ship, and I suddenly came up with this idea. So if you look at most modern ships these days, especially things like warships and cruise liners, etc., you'll find they have these capsules on the side of the ship. And what happens in an emergency, if the ship begins to sink or runs into big problems, these capsules get knocked off the side of the ship and turn into inflatable life rafts. And that's exactly how we're going to make escape pods on this ship. Now, I know you're probably going to think, that's crazy. I mean, Draken, inflatable lifeboats in space, but actually not as crazy as you may think. It was only a couple of years ago that a company tested up on the International Space Station the idea of an inflatable module. And while that test initially ran into a couple of problems and it sort of only semi-inflated, the concept is still quite valid. If you have a good enough flexible material that's also fairly strong, you can just fill it with air and then put people inside of it. And of course, the idea of a lifeboat is it's not meant to sustain people for long periods of time. It's only to keep them survived long enough until rescue can come along and grab you. This is the same with lifeboats on ships, and it's also the same with lifeboats on starships. I'd imagine these lifeboats don't look like your lifeboats, though, that you inflate at sea. They're probably more like basically big inflatable Zorbs capable of holding several people. The idea is simple. If the ship runs into problem, then the capsules break open, and with a tether line, they drop the lifeboat out, and it begins to inflate. And there's probably like a little module in the middle that helps with that. It's like a little life support system that's attached to the middle, and it will steadily inflate. Now, of course, obviously, then the crew have got to be able to get on board. And with that, they just need to be wearing their spacesuits. They don't even need to actually have like any EVA packs or anything else. They could be just using tether lines and magnetic boots. And with a tether line, they can sort of move over to where that line is holding the escape pod to the ship, and then sort of go down the rope to the actual escape pod itself before finding an airlock on the actual thing and getting on board of the escape pod. And you could probably hold about 6 crew per escape pod or a lifeboat, inflatable lifeboat. And then once they're ready, these lifeboats will probably have a couple of little maneuver jets on them just darted around the outside. Again, even though it's mostly inflatable, doesn't mean you can't have some hardware inside of there. And so what it would do is then just detach from the ship and just gently push itself away from the ship, especially if there's any sort of dangers of the ship sort of exploding or something, and push yourself away and sort of sustain people for a couple of days, up to a couple of days, until rescue can come along and pick the crew up. And though the crew may be wearing spacesuits, inside the actual lifeboat, they probably wouldn't need the spacesuits because you'd have like a life support unit in the middle there, along with sort of basic controls and sort of a distress beacon sort of built into the central control structure in the middle of the orb that's probably being held by a couple of little tether lines inside, and then sort of leads out and sort of wires that go off to the modules. And of course, if you're going to question, well, how are you going to put an airlock on there? Because obviously people have got to get on and out, and if you're going to fill it up with air, you can't just open the outside door. But actually all you need is literally just 2 pieces of fabric, or sort of space resistant fabric, so to speak, that are making up the outer skin. You open up the outer one, you put yourself in there, and you have some sort of like magnetic zip or something like that does itself back up again. At this point, you're still in vacuum. But if it's quite tightly held together, all you need to do is open up then the zip on the inner one, and you just go straight into the actual orb itself, with it being sealed and no air leaking out. If you need to leave the lifeboat again for whatever reason, then you could turn around and do the same in reverse. But this time, when you get into the airlock, the inner door sort of closes around you, and you have like a little vacuum pump in there that basically pumps the air back out, because you don't want to waste any air when you're on a lifeboat, and sort of almost like vacuum packs you between the 2 layers before you open the outer layer and go back out again. So you don't even need like a full expansive airlock. It's just these 2 sheets that basically enable you to pass between the 2 sides of the actual ship. And honestly, I quite like this concept. I mean, it plays into what is actually some modern theories about how we can do inflatable modules and things in space, and that it is actually quite viable. And you could sort of say, could it sustain things like micrometeorites? And actually, potentially it can. And especially remember, these things aren't designed for long life, the same as inflatable lifeboats on board a ship. You don't go into a lifeboat on board a ship, an inflatable lifeboat, and expect to live in there for days and days on end. You know, it's not going to be as hard wearing as a ship itself. The idea is it's a matter of last resort. It's somewhere to keep you alive for a couple more days until rescue can get to you. And with the ship, I've turned around and I've put 6 of these modules darted around the ship itself. And the idea with each one being able to hold 6 people in each of these modules as well means that there's actually potentially you can hold up to 36 people in there. Now bear in mind, we've only got 17 crew and up to 4 guests normally on board ship. That could be up to basically 21 crew, which still gives you another 15 crew capacity, which means that if you need to lend it to other ships, or you don't quite fill one, or one of them gets damaged, you've got some spares on the ship as well. Okay, so it's time to just go on and add a few more little bits and pieces to finish off this ship. So the first thing was a few like little boxes on the side here. I thought these could like contain drones or something to help with repairs outside, and also just put a few more other little greebles here and around the ship itself, including building hand railing. And the reason for the hand railing is because you're going to have engineers on board the ship. If the ship gets damaged, there's going to be times when they're going to need to come outside of the ship, and they're going to need something to be able to sort of bolt onto, harness themselves up to, and sort of be able to sort of keep themselves safe. So they've probably got magnetic boots on as well, but they're probably going to need some sort of tether or something like that to keep them attached to the ship. And yes, I know it's sci-fi. We could probably come up with some sci-fi things that people do, but also sometimes the simplest ideas are the best ideas. One of the other greebles I realized I was going to have to put onto here was lighting, and I realized we're going to put some navigation lights on here. Now, navigation lights, obviously, if you're out in the midst of space, in the middle of combat, you're not going to have navigation lights on. But if you're like coming into like docks, etc., and you need to be able to show, or you're in normal peacetime area, you're probably going to want to have navigation lights on. And yes, again, it's sci-fi. You probably would have all these different sort of systems that are in place. We do now. We have like radio systems that turn around and identify different things to each other, aircraft and ships to one another. But it's still going to put lights on there because, again, if those systems fail, then sometimes you've got to revert back to things like the good old Mark I eyeball to be able to actually see what's going on around you. But when it came to navigation lights, I realized there was a bit of a problem we had to solve. You see, in the real world, what we do is we have on the left-hand side of the ship, what's known as the port side of the ship, we'll have a red light. And on the starboard side of the ship, or the right-hand side of the ship, we'll have a green light. With this combination, you can then work out whether a ship is coming towards you or going away from you. So if the red light is on the left as you see it, then you know the ship is orientated the same way you are and it is heading away from you. Alternatively, if the red light is on the right hand side, which is the opposite way to what it would be for your own orientation, then you know that ship is coming towards you. In addition to this, a lot of ships will also have a white stern light, and that will also help you to work out if the ship is going sideways to you and which direction it's going, whether it's going to the left or to the right. And it's not just ships that use this navigation pattern, aircraft do as well. And here, once again, we can see on the wingtips, obviously you've got on the left-hand side, the plane is the red light, on the right-hand side is the green light. If you see it in that configuration, you know the plane is flying the same direction you are. If you see it in the opposite configuration, you know it's flying towards you. So quick quiz, you see this out at sea at night, you see these two lights. Looking at this light configuration, which way is the ship facing? Well, the red, or the port side, is on the right as we're looking at it, so if you said the ship is coming towards us, you would be correct. And again, if you saw this configuration of lights at night, and if you said the ship was moving to the right, you would be correct. And now say we're flying in the night air, you see this configuration of lights, what would you be expecting the plane to be orientated as? And if you say the plane is flying away from us, you would be correct. Of course, we could just take this system immediately and put it onto our ships. Again, having red on the port side and green on the starboard side in exactly the same way we configured the aircraft and the ships. But we do run into a problem. Let's do a little quick quiz again. Which way would you say this ship is facing? Now, if you said it was facing away from us, you were actually wrong. It was coming towards us. The problem is the ship is orientated also on another axis upside down. So in relation to us, it's 180 degrees, flipped 180 degrees. Because in space, it's three-dimensional. They'd be coming from any angle. So just a green and red light alone is not going to cut it. Now, of course, this isn't a problem for ships or for planes, because if a ship is upside down, then it's capsized. And, you know, though planes can fly upside down, the times when they need navigation lights, if they're upside down, they're in a lot of trouble. This is not the case for spaceships, though. Spaceships could be at any orientation and angle, which means that the normal sort of two-dimensional version of the navigation lights is not going to work. We can solve it, though, by adding a fourth light, what I call a keel light. So yeah, I've designated that a blue color. I'm not sure how great blue would be, because how close it would be to white for the stern light, but it was the only other color I really could sort of thing that could be distinguished quite differently. But by having a keel light now, it is now working. You can now work out whether the ship is coming towards you or away from you, depending on the configuration of the three lights. If you take the blue light and you sort of go sort of in a clockwise direction or going to the left, and you come across a red light, then you know the ship is going away from you. However, if you go in a clockwise direction to the left and you come across a green light, you know that ship's coming towards you. And you could do all sorts of different ways in which you can memorize it, but essentially it's the same thing as what you've got with the two lights in a normal 2D plane, but now we've actually introduced a way of being able to recognize it in a three-dimensional plane. So if we take this as your next quiz, and you can see, again, we have this light pattern that is in the sky. It doesn't matter which way the ship is orientated. You can tell that the red is clockwise from the blue, and therefore the ship must be traveling away from us. And then there were a few more little greebles I wanted to put into the ship after the navigation lights. So first of all, I started doing these little domes that sort of sit all over the ship, very small little domes. And if these look like sort of security cameras you might see if you're walking around a store or something like that, you'd be quite right. They are. That's exactly what they are. They're cameras. So yeah, the cameras are concealed in these small, tiny domes that are sort of dotted around the ship. And the idea of the cameras is both to be able to look out beyond the ship and see what's beyond there, though I imagine a lot of what the ship does is actually relying on its actual sensors rather than on the cameras, but also enables them to actually look at the ship itself and see if there's anything like damage or anything else that's occurred and be able to see what's going on. Likewise, I added a few more lights around the ship. These lights aren't your navigation lights. These are things to light up things like the airlock and sort of be able to show those areas. So I sort of put those around there as well. Again, in the middle of combat, you probably wouldn't have these lights on. They'll be turned off. They're only turned on when you actually need them. That's the great thing with lights. You don't need to have them on all the time. Next up, I had to redesign the turret itself. I don't redesign it. It was still the same design. I just realized that the original version I'd done was slightly off-centered, hadn't actually got it even. I don't know how I managed to muck that up in the first place, but I had to fix that, so I went back in and fixed that bit. But After doing that, it was then on to basically the final straight in terms of actual hard surface modeling on this model. And it was basically getting the last bits in together. So while we're going through that, just a quick reminder that if you have enjoyed this video and you want to keep up to date on the things that I'm doing, especially in regards to my writing, my book series, and everything to do with this universe that I'm building this model around, click like and subscribe. It's as simple as that. Next up, I decided to put a little extra detail into the barrels of the gun, as well as doing the headlights for the ship itself, and then it was on to just the final details around the ship. The underside especially, I put a lot more detail into there, and it gets us to this final point where actually now we've done, and I'm really happy with the way this has turned out with all of the detail. If we compare this to the original G-Max model I showed at the beginning of the video, you can see this, to me at least, and hopefully you can see this as well, I think this is many times better than where it was. The final stage, of course, is texturing the ship itself, and I'm going to be honest here, I am not the best person for doing texturing of 3D models. I have to do a lot of learning to get it anywhere near where I want it to be. So for this, I just went with basically two very basic colors. I went with a nice metallic black for the outside of the ship itself, because the books are described as being colored black in the books, because if you're going to have military ships in space, then you're going to have them the same color as space itself. Now, this does present me some problems when putting this into some forms of artwork, where you're going to put it in space and you're not going to be able to see the ship at the end. But there are some tricks that I'm going to do around that, which I'm going to demonstrate in a minute, to be able to still show the ship, even though it is colored the same as space around it. But also the other color that I'm putting in here is obviously a nice little metal as well, like a nice chromish sort of color, silvery chrome, to sort of pick out some of the more metallic elements, things like the pipes, like the thrusters at the back, stuff like that. And so I've just been going around picking those bits out. So I just colored the whole ship black and then put these on afterwards. But, as I say, it's not the best texturing. Maybe I'll come back and revisit this once I learn some better techniques for texturing at some point in the future. But at this point, I just really wanted to see what this ship would look like, or get an idea of how the ship would look once you've got the color in there. And as you can see, putting it on a black background, it doesn't help. You just can't see the ship. It just becomes a silhouette. And all that wonderful detail I just put in there just gets lost. But I had this idea about how we could actually light it up, especially depending if we start posing this into different sort of scenes and ideas. And one of the ways is by having the light reflected off it from things like its boosters, and it sort of highlights up the elements of around the ship itself. So I sort of put some extra lights in there, put some thruster coming out the back there, and then also then having the main cannon at the front firing as well, and having this nice illuminated glow from the explosion at the front. Not the world's best explosions. I know I could probably again do better. I tried looking up some tutorials on how to do explosions in Blender. Didn't really quite get it. Yeah, so there's definitely things where I need to learn better on there as well. But you can start seeing it sort of starting to come together, ready for me to actually try and produce something with this, at least the first image. And the great thing with having a 3D model is that once you've got the model, you can pose it and make all sorts of different images from it in different angles and change the lighting. We can put it silhouetted against like a planet in the background if we wanted to, and stuff like that. And there's other ways, or against nebulas, so that you can actually see the ship and it's not just this black silhouette in space. That actually that we can try and pick some of that detail out that we just put in there, because, you know, putting all that wonderful detail in and then just losing the detail immediately because we've painted it black just seems to be a bit of a loss. But we got it to this stage, and sort of posing the camera, moving it around a bit, sort of got to this point. Now I'm going to have to cut the video here at this point, because I was about to go and render myself an image, and recording on the OBS software and also rendering at the same time in Blender. I mean, I've got a fairly beefy rig, but still nonetheless, you know, even running the render on this, my PC sounds like it was about to take off when I went to render it. So we're back in 2 seconds. So here is that first render. Now it's come out of Blender itself. There has been no additional post-processing done on here. This is just purely the render itself. And yeah, like you can see, the explosions, they definitely needed some work at the front there. They're coming out of the bombardment cannons. And yeah, I would say I like this. I don't think it is finished. I don't think this is where I exactly want it to be. I think we should pick up more of the detail with the light a little bit more from the thrusters. And from the explosion at the front, to really make it sort of stand out the way I want it to stand out, maybe sort of make the colours a bit more vibrant in there, get some more of that detail sort of captured in there as well. But I do like it though, I do, and it's nice to be able to see the ship sort of done in this way. I'm very happy with how this has become. But why do we need these rendered images? Well, it's not just for this video channel when I'm doing content. It is also because I'm trying to come up with concepts for the cover for my first book. Obviously, your cover sells it. This is not what the final cover is going to look like. This is me putting a mock-up together, using that imagery to come up with some sort of ideas about how it might go together. I think there's still a lot of work that's going to be done there. That's not a finished form. This is like very early prototyping. I'm going to warn that right now. But I do like this idea of having the ship coming in bright colours with a dark cover. Not so sure. I think the writing's maybe a bit too bright on here at the moment, and maybe we've just got to work on that a little bit and maybe change the different fonts and stuff like that. There's a load of stuff to be experimenting with. But that's it. That's me building the Dextus Class Frigate from my books. And stick around. There's going to be more videos of some like this, doing modelling, other sort of things to do with the books and the writing and everything else as well. And I hope to see you in the next video. Take care all.